The funds confirmed for Friday? That was the first thing my daughter-in-law said when I finally got her on the phone on a Wednesday afternoon in early November. Not, hello, not how are you doing, Martin? Just, are the funds confirmed for Friday? I told her I had sent the wire transfer the previous morning. She said good, because the contractor won't hold the date if the deposit doesn't clear. Then she told me she'd send over the final invoice breakdown when she had a chance. She hung up before I could ask the thing I had actually called to ask. I stood in my kitchen in Naperville for a long moment after that, looking out at the backyard. The oak tree my wife Carol had planted the year we moved in had finally started to turn, rust and amber at the edges. She would have made coffee and pulled a chair up to the window just to watch it. Carol passed 3 years ago from a stroke that came without warning on an ordinary Tuesday morning. And sometimes I still reach for the phone to tell her something before I remember. The thing I'd wanted to ask my daughter-in-law was when, exactly, the restaurant was opening. My son Kevin had been working toward this for the better part of 4 years. The place was called Birchwood Table, a farm-to-table concept in the Wicker Park neighborhood of Chicago. The kind of restaurant that gets written up in local food magazines and has a 6-week wait list inside of a year if everything goes right. Kevin had the talent for it. He had trained under serious people, worked his way up through kitchens that didn't tolerate anything less than precision, earned a following among the kind of diners who pay attention. The $295,000 I had put in came from the retirement account, Carol, and I had built over 34 years. I'd spent my career as a civil engineer with the same firm in the western suburbs. Carol had been a school librarian for 26 years. We were not people who came for money. We were people who showed up and put things away every month for a very long time. When Kevin came to me 2 springs ago with a business plan printed out and bound, I had read every page. I had asked questions. I had taken the whole packet to my accountant, a quiet man named Ed who had handled my taxes since 1998 and who told me the projections were optimistic, but not unreasonable for the Chicago market. I said yes because I believed in Kevin the way I imagine most fathers believe in their children, with a kind of certainty that precedes logic and doesn't require evidence. I did not ask for my name anywhere on the building. I did not ask for a seat at any table that mattered financially. I asked Kevin to keep me in the loop, to treat me not as a lender but as his father who had put his retirement into something Kevin cared about. For the first year and a half, he did. We talked every Sunday evening. He would walk me through the build-out, the menu development, the permit process, the equipment choices. He texted photographs of the kitchen taking shape. He called me from the restaurant one evening when the custom hood ventilation system finally passed inspection, and he sounded like a kid on Christmas morning. Those were good months. I kept a folder on my desk with printouts of the photos he sent. Then his wife, Stephanie, stepped in to manage the business side. Kevin explained this to me over dinner at my house last winter, somewhat carefully, the way you explain something you expect might land wrong. She had an MBA. She had done operations consulting for hospitality groups. It made sense for the business, he said. I told him it sounded like a smart move, and I meant it. Stephanie was organized and sharp, and she had always been professionally warm toward me in the way people are when they are trying. But from the month she took over the finances, our Sunday calls became briefer, less specific, then less frequent. Then they became occasional texts, usually forwarding something I needed to review or sign. I told myself this was how it goes. Businesses scale and people get busy, and a father who needs to be looped in on every detail becomes a liability. I had read enough to know that. But I kept waiting for the one detail that mattered, the opening date. 3 weeks after that Wednesday phone call, I was driving back from a hardware run on a Saturday morning when I found myself on the block where Birchwood Table was located. I hadn't planned it. It was just a route I knew, and I took it without thinking, and then I was there. I slowed down. There was a sandwich board on the sidewalk in front of the door. The exterior was done, the hand-lettered sign above the entrance, the frosted glass panels I had seen in renderings more than a year ago. Through the window, I could see the dining room, tables set, pendant lights on, a server moving between the bar and a foretop near the window. There were people inside, actual people, eating. I pulled over and sat there for a while with the engine running. The chalk on the sandwich board was not fresh. The edges had blurred from moisture, which in November in Chicago means more than a day or two. The planter boxes on either side of the entrance had plants that had settled into their soil. The glass on the door had a smudge at handle height, the kind that accumulates over weeks of use, not the kind you'd have on an opening week. I drove home. I did not go inside. That evening I called Kevin. It went to voicemail after 2 rings. I called the following morning. 1 ring, then voicemail. I waited a day and called again. Same thing. My son was declining my calls, and I want to be precise about what that felt like, because it is a specific feeling, different from being ignored by a stranger, different from a missed call. It is the feeling of being actively set aside by someone you raised, and it sits in a part of the chest that doesn't have a clean name. I called Stephanie instead. She answered on the 2nd ring. When did the restaurant open? I asked. I kept my voice the way I learned to keep it over 30 years of managing project timelines and contractor disputes, which is to say, level. There was a pause. Just a beat. We did a soft opening about 5 weeks ago, she said. Kevin wanted to work out the kinks before making a big deal of it. You know how he gets before anything public. I did know how Kevin got. He had been anxious before his high school baseball games, before his culinary school graduation, before anything that meant something to him. I had always tried to be a steady presence for him around those moments, not adding pressure, just being there. It had genuinely never occurred to me until that moment on the phone with Stephanie that my being there might be the pressure he was trying to avoid. I said, Stephanie, I want to make sure I understood you. The restaurant has been open for 5 weeks. She said, Kevin is going to call you. He's just been swamped with the opening period. I said I would appreciate that. He did not call that week, or the week after. I am not an impulsive person. Carol used to joke that I could turn a trip to the grocery store into a strategic planning session. But deliberate is not the same as passive, and I had spent enough years reading contracts and project specs to know when the numbers in front of me deserved a second look. I went back through everything. Every email, every wire confirmation, every document I had signed or initialed over the past 2 years. I spread it all across the dining room table, which is the table where Carol and I used to do our taxes every February, with the records and labeled folders, and the coffee going and the radio on low. I had kept everything. What I found, laid out like that, was not a clean picture. The original understanding between Kevin and me was not a formal contract. I had raised the idea early on. Kevin's face had done something I recognized, a kind of retreat behind the eyes, and he had said, Dad, I'm not going to sign a contract with my father. And I had backed off, because I had felt the particular embarrassment of a parent who has introduced the language of doubt into a moment of trust. That, I now understood, had been a mistake. Not a moral one on Kevin's part, not at that moment, but a practical one on mine. What I had was a series of emails. In those emails, Kevin had described my contribution as a founding investment, with the understanding that I would be kept informed of major decisions and significant milestones. His words, a restaurant opening is, by any reasonable definition, a significant milestone. I also had the invoices. I began going through them carefully, the way I used to go through contractor billing on large infrastructure projects, looking for line items that didn't have a clear parent document. What I found was a recurring monthly charge listed as brand and marketing consulting paid to an LLC I didn't recognize. It had been running for 9 months. The amount was $3,200 a month. 9 times $3,200 is $28,800. I called Ed, my accountant. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued about him. Then he said, Do you know who registered that LLC? I said I did not, but I intended to find out. Business entity registrations in Illinois are a public record, something I knew from years of working with county permitting offices. It took me about 40 minutes online. The registered agent of the LLC was a woman named Brittany, who was Stephanie's younger sister. Brittany's LinkedIn profile listed her as a freelance social media consultant with 3 years of experience, primarily in lifestyle and fitness content. She had no apparent background in restaurant marketing, food and beverage branding, or hospitality of any kind. $28,800. I sat with that number for a long time. I did not call Kevin, not yet. Instead, I called my old colleague Warren, who had retired from construction law 2 years ago and spent most of his time now at his place on Lake Geneva. We met for coffee at a diner in Downers Grove on a Tuesday morning. I brought the invoices. I brought the emails. I set everything out between our cups and let him read through it. Warren is not the kind of man who performs reactions. He read everything slowly, and then he looked up and said, "Have you seen the operating agreement for the LLC that owns the restaurant?" I said I had not. He said, "You should." I hired a paralegal, a woman named Alice who did freelance work and came recommended by Warren to pull the full corporate structure. She came back to me in 10 days with a document summary and a look I recognized from years of project closeout meetings when the final numbers don't match the projections. The operating agreement listed Kevin and Stephanie as co-members of the LLC that owned Birchwood Table. My investment was documented as a capital contribution, not an equity stake, which meant I had no formal membership interest and no voting rights and expenditures. This was technically consistent with what Kevin and I had discussed, since I had not asked for equity. But it also meant that all spending decisions, including the monthly payments to Brittany's company, were within the discretionary authority of the managing members, which was Stephanie. Kevin was listed as co-member, but Stephanie held the managing member designation. There was more. The personal guarantee on the restaurant's commercial lease had been signed by Kevin alone, not jointly with Stephanie. If the business ran into serious trouble, Kevin was the one personally exposed. Whatever Stephanie's role in managing the finances, the legal and financial downside risk was sitting entirely on my son. I don't know what conversations happened in someone else's marriage. I don't know what Kevin knew or didn't know about the full scope of what was being charged. What I knew was that my son had signed his name to a significant liability while his wife held the spending authority, and a portion of the money I had contributed was flowing to her sister's consulting company every month. I called Kevin on a Sunday morning. He answered on the fourth ring. He sounded like a man who has been anticipating something and is relieved and exhausted in equal measure that it is finally arriving. That was all he said. I told him I would like to come to the restaurant, not to surprise anyone. I was letting him know now. Wednesday afternoon. I would like Stephanie to be there. He said he would talk to her. Wednesday came. I drove into the city in the afternoon, found a parking garage 2 blocks from Wicker Park, and walked the rest of the way. The late November air was sharp, and the street was quiet during the pre-dinner lull. I stood outside Birchwood Table for a moment before I went in. The sandwich board on the sidewalk said the dinner service started at 5. It was 2:45. Kevin had texted to say the door would be open. The dining room was empty. Clean white tablecloths, the pendant lights on low, the open kitchen visible through the pass. It was a beautiful room. I want to say that clearly because it is true. Kevin had built something beautiful, and standing inside it for the first time I felt the pride and the grief of it in the same moment, the way you sometimes feel two things that should not coexist and yet do. Kevin came out of the kitchen. He looked tired and older in a way that felt recent rather than gradual. He hugged me, and I held on for a second longer than I usually would. Stephanie came out a minute later from the office in the back. She looked composed, the kind of composed that takes preparation. We sat at a table near the kitchen pass. I put the documents on the table, not dramatically. I just set them down and smoothed them flat. I said I would like to go through these together. What followed was close to 2 hours. I will not put all of it here because some of it belongs to Kevin and not to anyone else, but the shape of it was this. Stephanie explained that Brittany's services had been essential during the pre-launch and opening phases, that the social media presence had driven meaningful traffic, that it was a legitimate business relationship. Kevin said he had known Brittany was doing work for the restaurant. Stephanie said Kevin had reviewed and approved the consulting arrangement. Kevin said he had agreed to bring Brittany on in a general sense without seeing a specific monthly number. It was painful to sit through, not because I believed one of them was lying, though there were moments when I genuinely could not tell. It was painful because I could see my son sitting across from his own wife in the restaurant they had built together, realizing that they did not have the same version of events, that they had been operating from different understandings of what had been agreed to and what had been shared, and now those two versions were being laid next to each other on a white tablecloth in front of the man who had made the whole thing possible. I did not raise my voice. I had spent too many years in project meetings and city council hearings to mistake volume for authority. I let them finish. Then I said quietly that I needed two things: a full accounting of every dollar spent for my capital contribution, and a formal repayment plan for the amount paid to the consulting LLC that I had not explicitly approved. I said, Kevin, I am not asking for this because I need the money back. I am asking because I need to know that we are being honest with each other. That is what I am asking for. Stephanie said she would need to speak with their accountant. I said, of course, take 2 weeks. I pushed back from the table and Kevin walked me to the door. Stephanie stayed in the back. We stood in the restaurant entrance for a moment, Kevin with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking past me at the street. He said, I didn't know she was paying Brittany that much. I want you to know that. I looked at my son for a long moment. I have known this person since before he had words. I know what his face looks like when he is telling the truth and what it looks like when he is managing someone. What I saw was someone telling the truth. I said, I know. And I said, that is something you are going to have to work out with her. Not for me, for yourself and for this business. He nodded. He did not say anything else. I walked back to the parking garage through streets that were starting to fill up with the early dinner crowd. The cold had gotten sharper. I stopped at a light and watched a couple walking ahead of me in no particular hurry, and I thought about Carol, about the year we bought our house, and how terrified we were to sign a 30-year mortgage on 2 modest salaries, about the discipline it had taken and what we had done it all for. We had done it for a life together and for Kevin, in roughly that order. And the money I had given him was as close as I could get to giving Carol a voice in his future after she was no longer here to give it herself. That mattered. What happened to it mattered. 2 weeks and 3 days later, I received a document from Stephanie's accountant. It was a full accounting, 12 pages, every expenditure categorized and dated. The total paid to Brittany's LLC over 9 months was $28,800. The repayment proposal offered to return that amount in monthly installments over 24 months, drawn from the restaurant's operating revenue. I sent the document to Warren. He called me that evening and said it was fair and that the 24-month timeline was realistic given what he could see of the restaurant's revenue projections. I told Warren I would accept it on one condition. Going forward, any non-operational expenditure above $4,000 required my written acknowledgement before it was executed. Warren sent a short amendment to that effect. Stephanie signed it 4 days later. She did not add any comment. She signed it and sent it back. After that, things moved differently. Not easier, not immediately warmer, but more honest. Kevin and I went back to talking on Sundays. The calls were shorter in some ways, more careful in others. He told me things he had not told me before, that the first 2 months after the soft opening had been rougher than the projections suggested, that he had been afraid to tell me because he didn't want me to regret putting the money in, that he and Stephanie had been having difficult conversations about how the business was being run that had started well before I became aware of any of it. I told him he should have come to me. I told him I was not a man who needed his children to protect him from reality, that I had handled difficult realities for a long time, and I would rather be inside the difficulty with him than kept comfortable outside of it. He said, I know, Dad. I should have. I will not pretend that the missed opening did not matter. I had imagined it in the idle way you imagine things you're looking forward to, standing in a room Kevin had built, shaking hands with the people he worked with, feeling the specific kind of pride you feel when a person you helped bring into the world creates something real and lasting. That moment had passed without me, and I want to be honest about the fact that it left something behind that did not fully go away. But the following February, Kevin called on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual, and asked if I would like to come to the restaurant before dinner service on Saturday. He said he wanted to show me something. I drove in on a gray February morning, and Kevin met me at the door. The restaurant was quiet, the prep cooks working in the back, the dining room still empty. He walked me through the whole space, The kitchen stations, the dry storage, the wine program, the walk-in coolers, the small private dining room they had built out in the back that had not been in the original plans. He explained every choice, what had worked and what he would do differently. He had printed out the first quarter revenue numbers and handed them to me, folded, like a report card he was nervous about. They were better than the projections, not dramatically, but solidly, sustainably better. We had coffee at the bar afterward, the two of us, before the staff started arriving. Kevin wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the dining room for a moment and said, "This wouldn't be here without you." And I understood that he meant more than the money. He meant the 34 years of showing up at a job and putting things away and staying steady. He meant his mother. I am 64 years old. I have lost a wife and outlasted a long career and sat across from enough difficult tables to know that the ones that matter are the ones you don't leave. What I would say to any parent in the position I found myself in is this: when someone you love asks you to trust them with something that took you a lifetime to build, and that trust begins to feel like it is being used rather than honored, your instinct to pay attention is not a failure of love. It is love doing its job. Document what matters. Ask the questions that feel uncomfortable. Request the accounting, because an accounting is not an accusation. It is just the truth written down in a language everyone can read. And if your son or your daughter is worth the investment, and in my experience they almost always are, they will sit across from you at that table and work through it with you, even when it is hard, even when their version and yours do not yet match. That is what family is, not the absence of difficulty, the willingness to remain at the table until you get to the other side of it. I keep coming back to the moment I sat in my car outside Birchwood Table with the engine running, looking at a sandwich board I had never seen before, realizing the restaurant had been open for weeks without me knowing. There was no rage in that moment, just a quiet, heavy arithmetic, the kind you do when the numbers in front of you tell you something you were not prepared to hear. What I understand now, looking back at all of it, is that things rarely fall apart because of one bad decision. They fall apart because of a series of small ones, each of which seemed reasonable at the time. I did not insist on a formal agreement because I did not want Kevin to feel doubted. Kevin did not tell me about the soft opening because he did not want me to feel pressure. Stephanie approved payments to her sister's company because in her mind, the work justified the cost. None of those decisions were made in malice, but the accumulation of them created something that none of us could see clearly until it was laid out on a table in the middle of an empty restaurant on a November afternoon. That is what I mean when I say that integrity is not a single moment. It is a habit. It is the discipline of being honest in the small decisions, the ones nobody is watching, the ones that feel too minor to matter. Kevin is a good man. I believe that without reservation. But he had gotten into the habit of signing things without reading them, of delegating details he found uncomfortable, of letting the gap between what he knew and what he was responsible for grow wider than it should have. That habit did not come from bad character. It came from the desire to avoid difficulty, and avoiding difficulty, I have learned, is one of the most reliable ways to manufacture it. What got us through was not forgiveness in some abstract sense. It was the willingness to think clearly under pressure. When I sat down with those invoices and those emails, I did not act on the first thing I felt, which was hurt. I waited. I gathered information. I called Warren. I hired Alice. I let the picture become complete before I said a word to Kevin. That patience, that commitment to understanding before reacting, was the thing that made the conversation in the restaurant possible rather than catastrophic. You cannot resolve what you do not yet fully understand. And then, when the time came, I stayed. That is the part I want to be honest about, because it was not easy. There were moments in those 2 hours at the restaurant where I could feel something in me wanting to simply close the folder and walk out. The money, yes, but more than that, the principle of it. I had trusted my son with something that Carol and I had built together over 34 years, and that trust had been handled carelessly. Staying at that table required something I did not know I still had in sufficient quantity until I needed it, which was the resolve to keep going when the easier thing was to stop. Kevin called me a few weeks ago to ask my opinion on a catering contract he was considering. He read me the terms over the phone, line by line, and asked what I thought about the liability clause. I told him what I thought. He said he would have his attorney look at it before he signed. I told him that was exactly right. Carol would have said the same thing.